The city kept its promises in whispers and unpaid debts. Some names lived in the shadows so long they became part of the darkness itself. And one of those names was Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero. Tonight, we slip into the quiet of those shadows and listen to the last honest words of a man who believed loyalty could never be broken. Before we go any further, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? If it's late, if the night's quiet enough for a story like this, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a slow burn. And subscribe to Long Gangster Nights, where stories like this never sleep. He came from the Lower East Side, born into a city that didn't give second chances to kids who were born without them. His mother raised him in the rough rhythm of survival. No music, no poetry, just the scrape of rent due and the noise of tenements breathing through paper walls. He was quick to learn that rules were flexible when hunger wasn't. There were men on corners with shiny shoes and quiet voices who always seemed to have cash. And for a boy like Benny, that was all the education he needed. You could go to school, or you could go to the streets. One gave you grades, the other gave you respect. He didn't have to think long about which he wanted more. By his teens, he was running errands, delivering envelopes, and learning the silent hierarchy that ruled the blocks. You didn't talk unless you were asked. You didn't look away when someone spoke to you, and you never shorted a man above you. The first time he got slapped for saying too much, he learned faster than any teacher could teach. By his early 20s, he was dressing sharp, talking low, and walking with the kind of confidence that made people step aside. He wasn't made yet, but he was close, the kind of close that burns. The Bonano family was one of the 5, and it ran deep through the city like a current under the pavement. They were quiet, less flashy than the others, but deadly loyal. That loyalty attracted Benny, or Lefty, as he'd come to be known. The nickname came easy. He was a southpaw, always lighting cigarettes or writing notes with his left hand. And in that world, even something small became identity. Lefty sounded like someone you'd respect, or at least someone you wouldn't cross. He wasn't the kind of man who made noise for the sake of it. He wasn't flashy like Gotti, or poetic like some old-school bosses who thought themselves philosophers. Lefty was practical. He played cards. He collected debts. He handled business quietly. He'd lend money. He'd enforce rules. He'd sit in the corner of bars where the light was dim and the talk was honest. He didn't dream of being boss. He didn't have to. He believed the code itself was the crown. That's what made his eventual fall so tragic. Not the money, not the years lost, but the betrayal of a belief that had built his whole identity. The streets back then were a language. If you knew how to read it, you could walk without fear. Lefty spoke that language fluently. Every gesture, every silence, every nod across a smoky bar. He had a code, and he lived by it. Never rat, never steal from your own, and always pay respect to the chain above you. That was it. Simple rules that gave meaning to chaos. He didn't have much else in life. A few failed marriages, kids who barely spoke to him, and a world that rewarded loyalty with suspicion. But he held to that code like scripture. It was sometime in the mid-1970s when he met Donnie, Joseph Pistone, though nobody called him that in those days. He was Donnie Brasco, a jewel thief, sharp, quiet, the kind of guy who knew how to blend in without effort. Lefty liked him immediately. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was just the way Donnie listened when he talked. Lefty didn't have many people who listened. So he took Donnie under his wing, showed him the ropes, taught him the old ways, how to handle a sit-down, how to talk to the boss, how to read a man's eyes before his hands. You can almost picture it, the two of them walking through Little Italy, steam rising from the grates, the sound of traffic blending with laughter from open windows. They'd grab coffee at Donnie's favorite spot, talk about business, life, nothing. To Lefty, Donnie was more than a protege, he was a son. And that's the cruel poetry of it all. The only man Lefty ever truly trusted turned out to be the one wearing a wire. If you're sitting there, listening, maybe you're thinking, how could he not know? How could a man so deep in life, a man who knew the streets like his own heartbeat, not see the signs? But that's the thing about trust in that world. It's not logical, it's emotional. Once a man calls you friend, he's blind to everything else. Lefty taught Donnie how to survive in that life, but he never taught himself how to suspect the people he loved. The bond between them wasn't fake, though. Donnie, even as an FBI agent, felt it. He once said that if he weren't undercover, he might have stayed there, living that life for real. That tells you something about Lefty's pull, about the strange honor of the men he ran with. It wasn't about the crimes. It was about belonging, discipline, and brotherhood. When Donnie was finally pulled out, when the FBI ended the operation and revealed who he really was, Lefty didn't cry, didn't rage. He just sat there. The news came like a slow tide, and when it hit, it didn't break him loudly. It hollowed him out quietly. The family knew what it meant. If Lefty brought a cop into their world, he'd have to answer for it. But even then, he didn't run, didn't beg. He accepted it. That's who he was, a soldier to the end in another life. Lefty might have been something else, a mechanic, a small business owner, a father who came home every night. But fate doesn't deal cards kindly in neighborhoods like that. He was built by his environment, shaped by the echoes of loyalty and fear that filled the stairwells of tenement buildings. And when he finally stepped into the big time, he thought he'd found peace. But peace in that life is just the pause between storms. Sometimes, when you think about men like him, you have to wonder, what did they see when they looked in the mirror at the end? A criminal, a survivor, or just a man who believed too deeply in the wrong kind of honor? Lefty once said, "I put you with me. I trusted you. You're a wise guy now." Those words weren't scripted. They were real, raw, born from a loyalty that outlived the man himself. As the years turned, the story became legend, movies, books, documentaries. But beneath all that, the real Lefty remained quieter than all the noise. A man betrayed not just by a friend, but by the very system of trust he thought was unbreakable. He died poor, forgotten by many, remembered only by those who understood the cost of loyalty. And that's the truth of this story. It's not about crime, it's about belief, about how far a man will go for the world that gives him meaning, about the cost of trust, the pain of betrayal, and the dignity that somehow survives both. If you'd walked into the Motion Lounge in Brooklyn on a weekday afternoon in 1978, you'd have seen what looked like a group of ordinary men talking about ordinary things. Baseball, coffee, the weather, the Yankees bullpen. But beneath that chatter, the air was electric. Quiet codes, hidden in casual talk, decisions being made that would ripple through every corner of New York. And somewhere near the back table, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero sat with his sleeves rolled up, a small cup of espresso cooling beside his cigarette smoke. That was Lefty's classroom. The streets were his textbooks, and every conversation was a test. Life wasn't glamorous the way people imagine it, not the way the movies make it look. It was routine, structured, boring even. Mornings started with coffee, calls, checking in with the crew. By noon, maybe a sit-down, maybe collecting money, maybe just watching the door. In a way, that predictability gave the men a kind of peace. They knew the rhythm, what to say, when to laugh, how to listen. In a world where one wrong word could end a life, predictability was comfort. Lefty had been doing this for years. He was what they called a working guy, not a boss, not a big earner, but a man who made the wheels turn. He collected debts, loaned money, kept peace between smaller crews. He was respected but not feared, and that distinction mattered to him. Feared men don't last, he'd say. Respected men die old. He believed in that. He lived by it. And then came Donnie, to understand the bond between them. You have to understand what Lefty saw when he looked at Donnie Brasco. He saw himself, 20 years younger, hungry, smart, trying to make something out of nothing. Donnie didn't talk too much, didn't act like he was owed anything. He listened, he learned, and he showed loyalty without words. That's what drew Lefty in. Their friendship wasn't built in a day. It came through small moments, a shared cigarette after a long night, a quiet ride in the car, laughter over some story that didn't matter. It was those in-between moments that built trust. Lefty started teaching Donnie how things worked, the hierarchy, the language, the rituals. He told him which streets belonged to who, which clubs were safe, and which names you never mentioned out loud. It wasn't just crime they talked about, it was life. Lefty told him about his son, who was struggling with drugs, about the women who came and went, about the years he lost chasing a respect that didn't pay the bills. Donnie listened, nodded, maybe offered a word or two, but mostly he let Lefty talk. And in a world built on silence, that was everything. There's a moment recorded later, one of those tapes the FBI would use, where Lefty tells Donnie, "You don't know how it feels to wake up every morning and have nothing, but still have to act like you're somebody." That line says everything about who he was. Beneath the gold chains and tough talk, Lefty was just a man who wanted to matter. Life gave him that illusion that he mattered. Meanwhile, Donnie was playing his role perfectly. He knew how to stay quiet, how to fit in, how to show just enough street smarts to impress, but not enough to threaten. He was inside the Bonano family now, and the deeper he got, the closer he became to Lefty. Lefty introduced him to the bosses, men like Sonny Black Napolitano, who ran things with quiet authority. Sonny was calm, calculated, a man who understood power not as noise, but as presence. To Lefty, Sonny was everything the Mafia should be, disciplined, sharp, and loyal. He wanted Donnie to learn from him, to see how true men conducted business. The irony, of course, is that Donnie was learning all of this for the FBI. Every handshake, every whisper, every deal, all of it was being recorded. And Lefty, who had opened his heart to him, had no idea he was teaching a federal agent how to be a gangster. But if you strip away the betrayal for a moment, and just listen to their conversations. You hear something rare. You hear affection. You hear trust. You hear the sound of two men from opposite worlds finding comfort in the same pain. The FBI operation, called Operation Sunapple, was one of the longest undercover missions in Bureau history. 6 years. That's how long Donnie Brasco lived in the mob, breathing its air, eating at its tables, celebrating its holidays. 6 years of lying, pretending, becoming part of something he could never truly belong to. And through all that time, Lefty was his guide. By 1980, the Bonano family was under pressure. Other families were making moves. The feds were listening closer. And old school rules were starting to crack under modern greed. But Lefty still believed. He believed the old ways would come back, that honor still mattered, that a handshake was still sacred. When Donnie brought him a cut from a job, a bag of cash from some fake jewelry deals, Lefty didn't just take it. He split it fairly. He looked Donnie in the eyes and said, "We earn together. We eat together. That's how it's supposed to be." Those moments of loyalty, small, fleeting, were what made him human. That's why his story still hurts to tell. Every night, after the bars closed, Lefty would go home to a small apartment. No mansion, no cars, no luxuries, just a TV, an ashtray, and the quiet hum of the city outside. Sometimes he'd fall asleep in his chair, cigarette burning low, Sinatra playing on the radio. You'd think a man in the Mafia would live like a king, but Lefty never did. He made maybe $1,200 a month, most of which went to gambling debts and his family. That's the truth that most people miss. Not every wise guy lived like a movie star. Some of them were just men trying to survive the only way they knew how. But loyalty was his religion, and that's what would destroy him in the end. The deeper Donnie got, the more he had to act like one of them. He went to weddings, funerals, and he spoke the slang, wore the clothes, and lived the rhythm. He became, in every way that mattered, a mobster. And that's what made it so dangerous. The line between pretending and becoming blurred. Lefty didn't just see him as a partner anymore. He saw him as family. There's a moment people talk about when Lefty gave Donnie his first piece, a gun. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a gesture of belonging. "Now you're a man," Lefty told him. "You're responsible for your own life." It was both a gift and a curse. When you think about it now, all these years later, it feels almost tragic. The old man passed down the last piece of his belief to someone who could never keep it. But at the time, it was sacred. By 1981, the Bonano family was crumbling. Internal wars, wiretaps, betrayals. The FBI had more information than ever before, and Donnie's work was coming to its end. But Lefty didn't know that. He was still planning jobs, still talking about moving up in rank, still dreaming of the day when maybe he'd get the recognition he felt he deserved. There's something deeply human about that. A man at the edge of his life, still believing he's on the verge of something great. And then the call came. Donnie was gone, pulled out. The FBI shut down the operation and broke the news to the world. Donnie Brasco was not a mobster. He was one of theirs. The reaction was chaos. In the Bonano family, betrayal like that didn't come with explanations. It came with consequences. Lefty's name was suddenly on every whisper. He was the man who brought a cop into the circle, and he knew what that meant. He knew exactly how it would end. But even then, he didn't run, didn't hide. He told his girlfriend, "If I'm not back by tonight, you'll know what happened." Then he put on his best suit, took a slow breath, and walked out the door. That was Lefty, a man of contradictions, caught between loyalty and doom, love and deceit. A man who lived by a code the world had already stopped believing in. As he walked toward his fate, he didn't flinch. He didn't plead. He accepted it the way only old-school men could, with a quiet dignity that outlived the men who condemned him. But fate, it seems, wasn't finished with him yet. The city never noticed when Benjamin Ruggiero left his apartment that morning. It was just another day in Little Italy. Vendors shouting, traffic snarling, the faint smell of roasted chestnuts mixing with exhaust fumes. But for Lefty, it wasn't just another day. It was Judgment Day. He buttoned his shirt carefully, the same one he wore for good occasions. His shoes were polished, his jacket pressed, his hair combed neatly back. That's how men of his world faced death, not with tears, not with panic, but with quiet dignity. He'd lived his whole life by a code, and if that code demanded he pay with his blood, then so be it. The peeling wallpaper, the old armchair with the cigarette burns, the picture of his mother hanging slightly crooked. It wasn't much, but it was his. He picked up his hat, straightened his collar, and left without locking the door. What was the point? The FBI was watching. They knew. Donnie had warned them, told them that when the truth came out, Lefty's life would be in danger. So agents parked near his building, waiting, praying they'd get to him before his own people did. He didn't know they were there. Or maybe he did. Maybe he just didn't care. He got in his car, an old tan Cadillac, and started the engine. The radio was playing softly. Sinatra, again, My Way. Of course it was. Maybe that was coincidence. Maybe fate has a sense of humor. He lit a cigarette, took a slow drag, and let the smoke curl into the morning light. Then he drove. Every block brought him closer to the inevitable. He wasn't heading anywhere special, just to meet the men who wanted answers. But he already knew the questions, and he knew the price. Somewhere along Mulberry Street, the FBI intercepted him. They pulled him over, stepped out of their cars, and told him to get out. Lefty didn't argue. He looked at them, half amused, half resigned. "You're late," he said quietly. "You should have let me go." They took him in, not in cuffs, just to talk, to protect him. But protection meant nothing to a man like Lefty in his world. Living under the government's wing was worse than dying under your boss's order. Still, they sat him down, offered him coffee, tried to explain that Donnie wasn't who he thought he was. They said things like undercover operation, federal assignment, national security. But Lefty didn't hear any of it. He heard one thing only: betrayal. He stared at the table for a long time. No anger, no shouting, just silence. Then he said, almost to himself, "That kid, ... he fooled me good." You could see the heartbreak behind the calm. This wasn't just about a friend lying to him. It was about a world collapsing. For decades, he'd believed that loyalty was sacred, that honor was unshakable. Now, he wasn't sure what was real anymore. The FBI offered him a deal. They wanted him to testify, to help bring down the family. He could walk away clean, maybe even start a new life somewhere far away. But Lefty just shook his head. "I don't rat," he said. I die like a man. That was the code. Even in Betrayal, he refused to betray. When word spread through the Bonano circles, panic turned to violence. The bosses wanted answers. Who had let an FBI agent into their ranks? Who was responsible? Names started circulating: Sonny Black, Nicky Santora, and of course, Lefty. But the thing about Mafia justice is it isn't always logical. It's emotional, tribal, ruthless. Sonny Black, Lefty's old friend and superior, was also under suspicion. And in that world, suspicion was as deadly as guilt. Lefty knew what was coming. He'd been in life long enough to read the writing on the wall. Every phone call felt like a farewell. Every knock on the door, a countdown. A few weeks later, Sonny Black disappeared. They found his body months later, hands chopped off, face unrecognizable. That was how the family handled disgrace. And Lefty knew that should have been him. Maybe the only reason it wasn't was because of Donnie. Because the FBI, for all their manipulation, couldn't bring themselves to let the old man die for trusting too deeply. They kept watch over him quietly from a distance. They'd changed the rules just enough to keep him breathing. But Lefty didn't thank them. He didn't want saving. He'd rather have gone down the old way. The years that followed were strange, empty. For a man like him, the streets were everything. The motion, the noise, the rhythm. Take that away, and there's nothing left but ghosts. He started gambling more, drinking more, losing more. The suits got older, the cars slower, the phone quieter. Every so often, reporters would track him down, looking for quotes, for drama, for something to feed the public's endless appetite for Mafia stories. Lefty always gave them the same shrug. You want to know what it's like? It's like being married to the wrong woman for 50 years. You love her, even when she ruins you. He didn't speak much about Donnie, not publicly, anyway. But those who knew him said he never fully recovered, that somewhere deep inside he still missed the kid, still wondered if maybe, under different circumstances, they could have been real friends. Donnie, or Joe Pistone, later admitted that the hardest part of the operation was leaving Lefty behind. He said he respected him, even loved him in a way. That's what made the story so haunting. It wasn't black and white. It was two men on opposite sides of the law, each believing they were doing the right thing. The Mafia world moved on, but it never forgot. The Donnie Brasco operation changed everything. The 5 families became paranoid, fractured. Men who'd once shared meals now shared suspicions. They stopped trusting outsiders. The code was bleeding. Lefty lived long enough to see that change. He saw younger gangsters talking loud, flashing money, losing respect for the old ways. He'd sit in bars, sometimes, watching the new generation. Slick hair, gold watches, no discipline. They don't know what it means to earn, he'd mutter. They don't know what it means to lose. And maybe that's what broke him most. Not the betrayal itself, but the realization that the world he'd lived and died for was already gone in his later years. He got sick, cancer, bad lungs, the price of decades of smoke and stress. He lived in a small apartment, same as before, mostly alone. Occasionally, he'd get calls from old friends who were still alive, or from journalists trying to write the real story. He'd answer when he felt like it. Usually, he didn't. He wasn't bitter, just tired. You spend your life trying to be somebody, he once said, And then one day you wake up and realize nobody remembers your name. But that's not true. We remember. We remember because his story isn't just about crime. It's about the fragile nature of loyalty, about how easily love can become betrayal when the rules change. It's about the kind of man who doesn't exist anymore, the kind who meant every word, even when it killed him. There's a certain poetry in that kind of tragedy. Lefty Ruggiero didn't die a legend, but he lived as one, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully flawed. The FBI never fully understood men like him. They saw criminals, targets, case files. But inside those files were lives, complicated, human, full of contradictions. Lefty wasn't innocent, but he was honest in his own twisted way. And in a world built on lies, that's saying something. Sometimes, when you listen to the recordings, his real voice, gravelly and tired, you can hear the weight of it all. You know what it is, kid, he once said to Donnie. We're all dead already. Some of us just ain't got the memo yet. That's the kind of wisdom that comes from a life spent chasing ghosts. He passed away in 1994. No headlines, no fanfare, just an obituary for Benjamin Ruggiero, alleged organized crime figure. The newspapers didn't mention loyalty. They didn't mention love, just alleged. But those who knew him, really knew him, would tell you something different. They'd say he was a man out of time, a relic of an era when loyalty meant something, even if it cost you everything. And as the city lights flickered outside his window that final night, maybe he thought about all of it, the choices, the code, the betrayal. Maybe he thought of Donnie and the years they shared, and wondered if somewhere in another world they were still sitting together over coffee, laughing about nothing. Because in the end, that's all any of us want. Someone who remembers us, not for what we did, but for who we were when the noise faded. That's Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, the man who believed too much in a world that believed in nothing. The early days after Donnie joined Lefty's orbit were like slipping into the rhythm of a city that never really slept but occasionally sighed. The mornings began slow, with steam hissing from the coffee machines of Mulberry Street cafes, the dull scrape of spoons against chipped saucers, and the lazy shuffle of old men pretending to read newspapers. Lefty always sat in the same corner, his jacket tired leather softened by time hung from his shoulders, as if it remembered better days. He'd light up conversation before he lit anything else, muttering small talk about the Yankees, the weather, or the new kid who thought he could run numbers better than the old guard. That kid, of course, was Donnie. Only Lefty didn't treat him like a kid anymore. He treated him like a stray mutt that might learn to sit still if you fed it long enough. The first few weeks were tests disguised as errands. Go to the deli on Broom. Tell Sal you're with me, he'd say. And Donnie would go, the sound of his shoes echoing between graffiti-bruised walls. Lefty always watched from afar, pretending not to, a quarter-turned glance through cafe glass, eyes narrowing in satisfaction when Donnie came back with the right envelope or the right nod from Sal. Trust, in their world, wasn't given. It was earned one errand, one silence, one unasked question at a time, one late afternoon, as the sun melted into a gold smear over the tenements. Lefty took Donnie to the East River. The water smelled like rust and memory. You know, kid, Lefty said, tossing a pebble into the current, people think this life's about money. It ain't. It's about respect. You lose that. You're dead, even if your heart's still beating. Donnie listened, hands in his coat pockets, trying to mirror the older man's posture. The river carried their reflections away. Two shadows joined by coincidence, and something neither could yet name. Over the next months, they fell into a pattern. Mornings at the cafe, afternoons running errands that were never really errands, messages to be delivered, introductions to be made, small envelopes traded for large smiles. At night, Lefty would take Donnie to the smoky bars of Little Italy, where jukeboxes crooned Sinatra and the air smelled like spilled whiskey and secrets. It was in one of those bars, under the jaundiced light of a flickering neon sign, that Lefty first told Donnie about his beginnings. "I wasn't born for this, Jano," he said, tapping ash into a cracked glass tray. "I wanted to be a ball player. But life don't care what you want, it just hands you what's left." Donnie learned to nod at the right moments, to laugh when Lefty's stories veered from tragic to absurd, like the one about the parrot he kept in his apartment, a bird that cursed more than most men and, according to Lefty, understood loyalty better than half the crew. Donnie visited once, saw the cramped apartment lined with faded photographs, a chipped crucifix on the wall, the smell of fried peppers hanging in the air. Lefty fed the parrot sunflower seeds and grumbled, "Don't tell nobody you saw this dump. They think I'm a big shot." But the truth was, Lefty didn't need to be a big shot. He needed someone to listen, and Donnie, posing as a friend, gave him that. As seasons changed, their friendship became the kind of bond that sneaks up on you. They spent hours in the front seats of aging Cadillacs, the dashboard sticky with spilled coffee, windows cracked open just enough to let in the city's heartbeat. Lefty talked about everything: the bosses he'd served, the hits he'd dodged, the respect he'd lost somewhere along the way. "You gotta know when you're small time," he said once, voice rough with something close to resignation. "Me, I made peace with it. I ain't no boss, but I'm a man of my word. That still counts." Donnie nodded, eyes hidden behind the same mirrored shades he wore to every meet, the weight of his tape recorder invisible under his jacket. There were moments of tenderness, too, moments that would haunt Donnie later, like the day Lefty brought him to a family cookout in Jersey. Kids running in circles, women gossiping over pasta salad, Sinatra again somewhere in the background. "This is my friend Donnie," Lefty said proudly, clapping a hand on his shoulder. No one questioned it. In that brief sunlight, Donnie wasn't an FBI agent. He was just another face in the neighborhood, another guy who liked his steak burnt and his beer cold. The illusion held until dusk, when they drove back into the city and the skyline swallowed the stars. Lefty's loyalty deepened as his circle of trust shrank. Old friends went to prison. Others vanished, their names whispered only in back rooms. But Donnie remained. "You got something different, kid," Lefty said one night, slouched in the passenger seat as rain painted streaks on the windshield. "You listen. Most guys, they just wait to talk. You listen. That's rare." Donnie's throat tightened. He knew every word, every confession would soon be played back in an evidence room, dissected by strangers who would never understand the ache behind them. The city hummed outside like a restless animal. Streetlights flickered, cab horns bled through the night. In those quiet drives, the lines blurred between duty and friendship, between truth and survival. Donnie began to see the weariness in Lefty's eyes, the kind that comes from carrying too many memories. He started to wonder if betrayal could feel like mercy, and yet, beneath the fatigue, Lefty still carried a flicker of pride. He walked with a limp that was almost dignified, his hand always gesturing mid-story, his laugh sharp and sudden. To the younger men on the block, he was a relic. To Donnie, he was the last link to a code that was crumbling faster than anyone wanted to admit. It was around this time that the small tests became trustworthy. Lefty brought Donnie into card games, introduced him to minor earners, even vouched for him in front of high. "He's with me," he'd say, the words simple but heavy. In their world, that sentence was a contract sealed in blood and silence. Donnie accepted it with a nod, feeling the invisible weight of every hidden wire pressing against his ribs. Sometimes, on the way home from those late-night games, they'd pull into an all-night diner off the BQE. The fluorescent lights made everyone look a little ghostly. The coffee always tasted burnt, and the waitress always called Lefty Hun. He liked that. It made him feel seen in a world that had stopped looking. Donnie would sit across from him, half smiling, half studying, while Lefty picked apart the day's events like a man trying to squeeze meaning out of noise. "You know what kills guys like me?" Lefty said once, stirring his coffee with a spoon that clinked like a metronome. "We start thinkin' loyalty means the same thing to everybody. It don't." The spoon stilled. "Most fellas use it till it costs something. Then they find a new word." Donnie didn't answer. He couldn't. There were things the badge wouldn't let him say. But every time Lefty's voice cracked on the edges of a sentence, he felt the impossible weight of understanding. The recordings back at the bureau were becoming heavier, not because of what they captured, but because of what they couldn't. The smell of burnt toast at that diner. The sadness in the laugh of a man who had given his entire life to an idea already dying. Weeks bled into months. The city slipped through winter and came out colder, the kind of cold that bit at the bone and made even the toughest men walk a little faster. Lefty's overcoat looked older, his steps slower, but his eyes still flashed with the stubborn light of someone who refused to fade quietly. They met in the back of social clubs where the wallpaper peeled like old skin, where the jukebox still played tunes about love and loyalty, as if those words hadn't lost their shape. One evening, Lefty pulled Donnie aside after a game. "You ever wonder," he said, leaning close, "if we picked the wrong side of the dream?" The question hung there, absurd and sacred at once. Donnie kept his face still, the way he'd been trained, but inside, something shifted. He watched the way Lefty's fingers trembled slightly as he lit his cigarette, the way he inhaled like it was the only steady thing left in the world. They drove out to Brooklyn after midnight, engine humming low, city lights spilling across the windshield. "When I was your age," Lefty said, "I thought there'd be something at the end, a big payday, a throne. But all I got is a few suits and a bunch of guys who'd sell me out for gas money." He chuckled, a soft rasp that sounded more like surrender than humor. "You'll see. Life don't pay you back in cash. Shit pays you back in regret." Donnie filed the words away, not on tape, but in memory. These were the sentences that wouldn't make the reports, the confessions that couldn't be catalogued. He began to notice the smaller details, how Lefty always tipped waiters, even when he was broke, how he fed stray cats outside his building, how he made the sign of the cross every time an ambulance wailed past. In those gestures lived the man beneath the legend, a weary soul clinging to fragments of decency. Spring crept in like an apology. The streets filled again with noise, and with it came new tensions. The bosses were changing, alliances shifting like sand. Lefty, loyal to the old code, grew uneasy. He'd sit with Donnie in the cafe and mutter about kids who didn't know respect, about the business losing its heart. Used to be, you earned your bones with your hands, he said. Now they earn M with cell phones and lawyers. Donnie smiled faintly, hiding the irony that the system Lefty condemned was the same one he worked for. Their friendship became something almost sacred in its contradictions. By day, Donnie reported every word, every meeting. By night, he found himself defending Lefty to people who would never meet him. There was a strange tenderness between them two men from opposite sides of a moral wall, yet somehow standing shoulder to shoulder in the same rain. The night that marked the quiet turning point came without ceremony. They were in a backroom bar, the kind where the light barely reached the floor. Lefty was talking about a score gone wrong years ago, how he'd taken the blame to protect a friend who disappeared soon after. His voice faltered. That's the thing about friends, Donnie. They leave. Sometimes they don't even mean to, but they do. You hold on too tight, and you end up talking to ghosts. He stared at the condensation on his glass as if it could answer him. Donnie felt a chill crawl up his spine. After that, Lefty seemed softer, his jokes slower, his silences longer. He started giving Donnie little pieces of advice that sounded less like instruction and more like farewell. Don't ever trust a man who talks too much about loyalty, he said. Real loyalty don't need a speech. Another time, walking along the river again, he muttered, when the tide comes in, even the rats look for high ground. Remember that. And still, amid the fatigue, there were flashes of warmth, moments where the city seemed to hold its breath around them. A night at the racetrack, laughter echoing over the crowd as Lefty lost another bet and pretended not to care. A Sunday morning where they helped an old neighbor carry groceries upstairs. The woman calling them good boys, as if she could see none of the truth beneath their clothes. By the end of that year, Donnie was no longer just playing a role. He'd become a fixture in Lefty's life, woven into the small rituals that defined him: the morning paper, the afternoon coffee, the quiet prayer before bed. For Lefty, Donnie was the proof that maybe loyalty wasn't dead after all. For Donnie, Lefty was the living question of how far loyalty should go before it breaks you. By the late 1970s, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero had begun to feel something. He'd spent a lifetime suppressing doubt, the kind of doubt that crept in late at night, when the laughter of the crew had faded, when the bottles were empty, and when the street outside his apartment in Little Italy went silent except for the hum of a passing car. Lefty was old school, the kind of wise guy who believed in omerta like it was gospel. But as the years passed, he'd watched that code get thinner, weaker, men flipping, crews turning, bosses vanishing into witness protection, or winding up face down in alleys. The rules that once governed the life he'd given everything to seemed to be disintegrating. And in the middle of it all stood a man he trusted more than his own son, Donnie Brasco. Lefty had brought Donnie in like a family. They'd broken bread together, hustled together, bled together. He'd vouched for him, and in the Mafia, vouching for a man was like putting your soul on the table. If Donnie ever turned out to be wrong, if he was a rat or worse, it wouldn't just be Donnie who paid the price. It'd be Lefty. That was the rule. That was life. And as the streets began to hum with whispers, as law enforcement got closer, as the Bonanos themselves started to implode from the inside, Lefty could feel the walls tightening. He'd been a soldier too long not to notice the signs. There were new faces hanging around the clubs, men who didn't quite fit. The feds were listening in on phones, setting up cameras in restaurants, tailing cars they thought were clean. And all the while, Donnie seemed calm to calm. He always knew where to be, what to say, how to stay one step ahead. Lefty noticed it in small moments. A flicker in Donnie's eyes when someone asked about his past, or the way he'd slip out of a conversation when things got too personal. But each time, Lefty shut the thought down. Nah, he'd tell himself. Not Donnie. The kid's solid. He's one of us. But inside, something was shifting. The Bonanno family was crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. Rusty Rostelli, the official boss, was in and out of prison, and under him, captains like Sonny Black Napolitano and Dominic Sonny Red Indelicato were circling like wolves, hungry for power. Lines were being drawn, alliances shifting by the hour, and Lefty, a soldier without a fortune, found himself in the middle, loyal to Sonny Black, trusting his judgment, trying to keep his head down while the volcano erupted. One night at the Motion Lounge, Sonny Black's haunt, Lefty sat nursing a drink while the room buzzed with tension. Donnie was there, sitting quietly in the corner, smoking, listening more than talking. Sonny Black came over, his voice low, his tone heavy with something that felt like prophecy. "There's a storm coming, Left," he said, "and we don't know who's gonna survive it." Lefty just nodded, his eyes drifting toward Donnie, who was pretending not to hear. He didn't say it out loud, but the thought lingered. Storms always washed something away by that time. Donnie Brasco had been undercover for years. The FBI operation had gone deeper than anyone in the Bureau had imagined. What had started as a small-time infiltration had grown into one of the most dangerous and valuable intelligence operations in organized crime history. Donnie, real name Joseph Pistone, was living two lives so completely that sometimes even he struggled to separate them. But the closer he got to the top, the harder it became to protect the men he was supposed to betray. And no one made that harder than Lefty Ruggiero. Lefty wasn't like the other wise guys. He wasn't slick or calculating. He wasn't rich. He was, at his core, a soldier, poor, tough, fiercely loyal. He made his bones the old way, through pain, through blood, through absolute dedication. He didn't sell out. He didn't run. He didn't talk. And maybe that's why Donnie had grown to love him, even as he knew that love was going to destroy him. Every meeting, every job, every handshake was another step toward the day when the FBI would close the net, and Lefty's world would collapse. And Lefty could feel it. He just didn't know what it was yet. The Bonano Civil War erupted like a gunshot in the dark. Sonny Red and his faction plotted to take control from Sonny Black. The betrayal ran deep, old friends turning into enemies overnight. When the time came to settle it, Lefty was there, unknowingly walking into one of the bloodiest nights in Mafia history. The meeting was supposed to be business, a sit-down between captains to talk peace. But peace was never the plan. The bodies of Sonny Red, Phil Giacchini, and Dominic Trincera would end up buried in the dirt of Brooklyn, the smell of gunpowder still clinging to the walls. Lefty didn't pull the trigger that night, but he knew what it meant. He'd chosen a side, and in choosing Sonny Black, he'd sealed his fate. There was no turning back now. The FBI was everywhere, listening, recording, waiting. And the more Lefty moved up, the more Donnie had to pretend to belong. Deeper into a world where one wrong word meant death. There's a scene often told later by those who studied the case. Lefty and Donnie driving through the city, the sun setting, both men silent. Lefty looked out the window and said, "Donnie, you know what this life is. It's like holding smoke in your hands. You think you got it, but it slips through your fingers." He didn't know how right he was. That line would echo years later in FBI briefings, in movies, in the way law enforcement talked about the old school mob, the smoke of loyalty, the illusion of control, the tragedy of men like Lefty. The closer Donnie got to Sonny Black, the more Lefty faded into the background. He didn't show it, but it cut deep. Donnie was like his son, and sons were supposed to stay close. But the business was business, and Lefty had spent a lifetime being overlooked. Always the soldier, never the boss. That's just the way it is, he'd tell himself, lighting another cigarette. Some men are made for the street. Some men are made to sit at the table. Me, I'm made to stand guard outside the door. But now, he was starting to wonder whether the door was even real. The money was drying up. The feds were closing in. Wiretaps were picking up conversations that painted the Bonanos as reckless and divided. And while Lefty was hustling to keep his dignity, Donnie was recording every word, each meeting, each confession, each plan. All of it was being logged, analyzed, and fed into reports that would one day take down the family. Then came the day that changed everything. Donnie got word from his handlers. The operation was over. The FBI had enough. They were pulling him out, but that meant one thing. Lefty was going to die. If Donnie disappeared without explanation, the family would assume the worst, that Lefty had brought in a rat. And in the Mafia, that was a death sentence. The agents debated it. Should they tell Lefty the truth? Should they warn him? In the end, they didn't have to. Donnie couldn't stand it anymore. He called Lefty and said, "Don't meet me tonight." That was all. Nothing more. Just for words. But Lefty wasn't stupid. He knew the second he hung up that something was over. Something bigger than life itself. That night, he dressed carefully. A nice suit, clean shoes. He took off his watch, left his wallet behind. He told his girlfriend, "If Donnie calls, tell him I'll see him in a little while." Then he walked out the door, fully expecting not to come back. What happened next is part of the legend. Before the hit could come, the FBI swept in and arrested him. They'd saved his life, though he probably wished they hadn't. For Lefty, living with betrayal was worse than dying with honor. He'd spent his whole life building an identity around loyalty, around belief in something that no longer existed. And now, the kid he'd made, the one he'd trusted, had been an FBI agent all along. When the truth came out, the entire underworld reeled. The Bonanos were humiliated. Sonny Black, who'd trusted Donnie as much as Lefty did, paid with his life, killed, his body dumped. his hands cut off in retribution for letting an outsider in. The code was broken, the family shattered, and Lefty went to prison, not for murder, but for the quiet, lonely crime of believing too much. He served his time quietly, an old man among ghosts. When he got out, the world had changed. The mob wasn't what it used to be. The codes, the honor, the loyalty, all gone. The streets were different, the men were different, and Lefty Ruggiero, the old soldier who gave everything for the life, had nothing left to give. He died in 1994, sick and forgotten, in a small apartment far from the spotlight. But in the shadows of film reels and FBI transcripts, his name lives on, not as a villain, not as a hero, but as a tragic reminder of what life really cost when the operation finally ended. It wasn't with the crack of gunfire or the roar of engines on Mulberry Street. It ended quietly with the low hum of a phone call and the sound of men in suits closing file folders in dimly lit offices. The FBI had done what no one thought possible. They had infiltrated one of the 5 families from the inside. And the evidence Joseph Pistone, Donnie Brasco, brought out would cripple the Bonano family for years. But outside those offices, in the cramped apartments of Little Italy, in the corners of bars that still smelled of bourbon and fear, the human wreckage of that mission was only beginning. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero didn't die the day Donnie disappeared, but something inside him did. When the agents came for him, he didn't fight. He didn't curse. He didn't even seem surprised. There was a strange calm about him, a hollow acceptance that life had finally caught up. For decades, Lefty had lived by the rules. Never rat, never run, never regret. He'd believed in those words as if they were commandments carved into his skin. But now, standing under the harsh light of the interrogation room, surrounded by men in dark jackets who called him Mr. Ruggiero, he realized that the code he'd built his life on was nothing more than smoke. The Bureau thought they were rescuing him from a hit that Sonny Black's crew had already approved. But to Lefty, it wasn't a rescue. It was a theft, the theft of his final dignity. He was supposed to go out like a soldier, not live to see the day when everyone knew he'd been fooled by a Fed. To him, that was worse than death. When they told him the truth, that Donnie Brasco was Joe Pistone, FBI, Lefty didn't react. No anger, no disbelief. Just a silence so deep it made the agents shift uncomfortably in their seats. After a long moment, he said quietly, "If you're gonna lie to me, lie good." But they weren't lying. They showed him pictures, reports, tapes, his whole life, his friendship, his loyalty, all of it documented, analyzed, recorded in neat typewritten pages. Every word he'd ever said to Donnie was in a file. And as he looked through them, something broke behind his eyes. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was existential. For a man like Lefty, trust wasn't given, it was forged in blood. To find out that the man he'd called his kid, the one he'd brought into the life, had been an agent all along, it wasn't just a betrayal of him, it was a betrayal of everything he believed, defined manhood, loyalty, and love. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Sonny Black Napolitano's world was collapsing. When the FBI revealed the operation, Sonny's fate was sealed. In the Mafia, ignorance wasn't a defense. He had vouched for Donnie, and that meant he had to pay. His own men, the ones who'd once laughed and drank with him, called him in for a meeting. Sonny didn't argue. He didn't run. Like Lefty, he knew the rules. He left his jewelry and wallet behind, fed his pigeons on the roof one last time, and said to a friend, "If they find me dead, tell my people I didn't break." His body was later found in garbage bags, his hands cut off. The traditional punishment for letting an outsider touch Cosa Nostra business. Lefty didn't get that fate. Instead, he got prison. And for the first time in his life, he was alone, truly alone. The walls of the cell were quiet in a way the streets never were. No laughter, no deals, no voices echoing from the back room of a social club. Just silence. The kind that forced a man to sit with himself. And Lefty didn't like who he was sitting with. He'd always believed in destiny, that he was born into life, that he was meant to be a wise guy. But sitting there, staring at the gray wall, he began to wonder if life had ever really believed in him. The bosses got rich, the connected guys got out, but soldiers like him, the loyal, the obedient, the ones who did the dirty work, they got nothing but prison and death. And what did it all mean if even loyalty was a lie? The FBI didn't know what to do with him. Some agents felt sorry for him. Others said he deserved everything that came his way. But one thing was undeniable. Without Lefty, the Donnie Brasco operation would never have succeeded. He was the gateway, the proof, the human key that opened the doors of the Mafia. In the official reports, he was just another name, another piece of evidence. Back in the Bureau's offices, Joe Pistone was sitting with his handler, going through debriefs. The operation was called one of the most successful infiltrations in FBI history, but there was no celebration. Pistone looked hollowed out, tired, aged beyond his years. He'd lived as Donnie for so long that he no longer knew where the act ended and the man began. And more than anything, he couldn't stop thinking about Lefty. In interviews years later, Pistone admitted that he struggled with guilt. If Lefty had been made, he said, he would have died that night. He was walking out the door to get killed because of me. It was a truth that haunted both men, one in prison, one in protection. They were on opposite sides of the law, but bound forever by a twisted kind of love and betrayal. For Lefty, the years that followed were slow and gray. Prison wasn't new to him. He'd done time before, but this time was different. He wasn't doing time for a crime. He was doing time for being a fool. The other inmates knew who he was. Some respected him, others laughed. "You're the guy who got played by the Fed," they'd say. And Lefty would just nod. He didn't fight it. He'd lost the will for that. Somewhere inside, he still believed in the old ways, that if you took a beating, you took it like a man. But that belief was all he had left. When he was finally released, he returned to a city that had forgotten him. The mob he'd known was gone. The Bonano family was in pieces, swallowed by indictments and paranoia. The streets that once buzzed with wise guys were now quiet. The social clubs turned into cafes and boutiques. Young men no longer dreamed of being gangsters. They dreamed of being businessmen. The Mafia had gone corporate, slick, unrecognizable. And Lefty, poor, proud, stubborn Lefty, had no place in it. He tried to live a normal life, whatever that meant. He worked small jobs, kept his head down, but he was a ghost walking among strangers. The neighborhood kids didn't know his name. The new wise guys didn't respect his era, and the old ones were either dead or hiding. The men he once looked up to were either testifying in court or rotting in cells. The FBI checked in on him from time to time, partly out of caution, partly out of guilt. They had destroyed the life he believed in, but they had also saved his life. It was a cruel irony. For a while, Pistone even thought about reaching out, writing him a letter, but he never did. What could he say? "I'm sorry I destroyed your life." There were no words for something like that. Lefty spent his final years in quiet poverty, living with his longtime girlfriend. His health declined. The cancer came, slow and merciless. And as his body began to fail, he spoke less and less. Those who visited him said he was still sharp, still stubborn, but the fire in his eyes, the one that had once lit up the back rooms of Brooklyn bars, was gone. What remained was a man stripped of illusions, haunted by the memory of a kid named Donnie who'd once called him friend. In 1994, Benjamin Ruggiero died in relative obscurity. There were no processions, no tributes, just a few old-timers who remembered his name, a few FBI men who knew his story, and a handful of neighbors who'd seen the quiet, frail man who walked to the corner store every morning for coffee. He was buried without fanfare, not as a gangster, not as a hero, but as something in between. But in the years that followed, his story became something larger. Books, films, documentaries, all tried to capture the tragedy of his life. And yet, none of them could fully explain the contradiction that was Lefty Ruggiero, a man who believed in loyalty more than anything, and yet was destroyed by the very loyalty he gave. He wasn't the last of his kind, but he was one of the last who truly lived by the old rules, the ones that said honor mattered more than money, that your word was your bond, and that betrayal, in any form, was the worst sin of all. If you walk the streets of Little Italy today, you won't find much trace of Benjamin Ruggiero. The bars he drank in are gone, the alleys cleaned, the names changed. But sometimes, if you pass by a dark corner late at night, you can almost imagine him there, leaning against the wall, cigarette in hand, shaking his head at what the world has become. Not angry, not bitter, just tired. Because in the end, maybe that's what life does to you. It doesn't kill you with bullets. It kills you with memories. When the case files on Operation Donnie Brasco were finally sealed, the celebration in Washington was restrained. There were no champagne corks, no victory speeches. The room where the agents gathered was lit with the same flickering fluorescent bulbs that had seen every meeting, every taped conversation, every sleepless debrief. The walls smelled of stale coffee and paper. For years, that room had been the nerve center of an operation that blurred every moral line imaginable. And now it felt like a tomb, not for the Mafia, but for the men who had given part of their souls to dismantle it. Joe Pistone stood by the window, looking down at the city. Outside, the streets moved on, unaware of the quiet reckoning taking place inside that building. He had spent 6 years in another man's skin, living a lie so convincing that even he had come to believe parts of it. Every gesture, every word, every laugh had been an act, and yet, somewhere in the middle of it, Donnie Brasco had stopped being a cover story and had become a person. Now, with that identity ripped away, what was left felt hollow. The Bureau called him a hero, but he didn't feel like one. Heroes slept at night. Heroes didn't wake up sweating with the image of a man's face. Lefty's face burned into their conscience. In the months after the operation ended, the Bureau ran internal reviews. They examined procedures, ethics, the use of long-term undercover work. But beneath the professional talk of protocols and success rates, an uncomfortable truth lingered. They had destroyed a man's life, a man who wasn't supposed to be the enemy anymore. Lefty Ruggiero wasn't a monster. He was, in some strange way, a victim of both worlds. The Bureau had used his trust as a weapon, and though they'd done it for justice, it didn't make the wound cleaner. Agents who'd worked with Pistone spoke of the strange unease that settled over the office afterward. Some said it was guilt. Others called it the cost of doing business. One agent, years later, put it bluntly, "We won, but it didn't feel like winning." The tapes told a story of success, but the men who'd listened to them night after night, hearing the laughter, the sincerity in Lefty's voice, the paternal affection, couldn't forget that somewhere in that laughter was a ticking bomb. Pistone himself spent months in debriefs and protective custody. He wasn't free. He was in a different kind of prison. New name, new location, new silence. He'd sit in anonymous motel rooms, the kind with faded curtains and the hum of an air conditioner that never quite worked, and play back moments from those 6 years. The card games, the long drives, the late-night talks. He'd hear Lefty's voice in his head, the way he said, "You're my guy, Donnie." And it would hit him all over again that it wasn't just a line. Lefty had meant it. He tried to rationalize it, tried to tell himself that he'd done what had to be done, that hundreds of lives had been saved, that the Mafia's grip on the city had been weakened. But late at night, when the world went quiet, none of that mattered. What haunted him wasn't the violence, or the danger, or the lies. It was the look in Lefty's eyes the last time they spoke, that unspoken bond between two men standing on opposite sides of an invisible wall. The Bureau's psychologists called it identity dissonance. Pistone called it something simpler, loss. He'd lost his cover, his sense of self, and most painfully a friend. In the old days, he used to say that undercover work was like acting. You stepped into a role and stepped out when the curtain fell. But the Donnie Brasco role had gone on too long. The curtain had stuck. Somewhere between the wires and the whispers, between the coded conversations and the blood, Donnie had become more real than Joe and Lefty. Lefty had become the kind of man the Bureau never expected to sympathize with. The reports said subject, suspect, associate, but behind those words was a man who lived by a moral compass more rigid than many in the Bureau. Flawed, yes. Criminal, certainly. But honest in a way that no bureaucratic language could capture. He believed in loyalty. He believed in honor. He believed in something that had long since rotted out of the system, and that made him dangerous, not because he was violent, but because he reminded everyone what they'd lost. After the operation, the FBI changed its training programs. They began teaching emotional distancing techniques, psychological self-monitoring, and post-undercover decompression protocols. Donnie Brasco had become both a legend and a warning. Future agents studied the case not just for its success, but for its toll, how it broke the line between right and wrong until both sides looked the same in the dark. Pistone was offered desk jobs, promotions, lectures. He refused most of them. He didn't want to sit behind a desk and talk about the operation that had cost Lefty his life. Instead, he wrote, He wrote to make sense of it, to find some order in the chaos. The words came slow, each one a small act of confession. When his book was finally published, it became a sensation, not because of the crime details, but because of the humanity it revealed. The world didn't see Lefty as a monster anymore. They saw him as a tragic relic, a man too loyal for his own time. But even then, the guilt never left, Pistone said once. In an interview decades later, you can't fake friendship for that long and not feel something. I didn't just betray an organization. I betrayed a man who trusted me. It was as close to an apology as he could ever give. Inside the bureau, the case became mythology. Young agents whispered about Donnie Brasco, the way kids talk about old war heroes. They admired the courage, the deception, the stakes. But the older agents, the ones who'd been there, stayed quiet. They knew what the story really was. It wasn't a victory story. It was a cautionary tale about the price of justice, about how, sometimes, catching the bad guys meant becoming a little bit like them years later. When Hollywood turned the story into a movie, Pistone sat in the dark of the theater and watched Al Pacino bring Lefty back to life. It was surreal. The gestures, the voice, the pain, all of it was there. For a brief moment, he felt like he was back in that smoke-filled apartment, listening to the real man talk about pigeons and lost dreams. When the credits rolled, Pistone didn't clap. He just sat there, staring at the screen, lost in the ghost of a friendship that had defined and destroyed him. The bureau moved on. The Mafia evolved. The city changed. But for the men who had lived it, both sides, time didn't wash it away. For Pistone, Lefty was the shadow that followed him everywhere. And for those who knew Lefty, Donnie was the face of betrayal that refused to fade in the end. That was the real tragedy of Donnie Brasco. Not the arrests, not the trials, not even the deaths. It was the silence that followed. Two men, both loyal in their own ways, both believing they were doing the right thing, and both left to carry the weight of a world that didn't forgive. And in that silence, the question that haunted them both lingered. If loyalty means betraying someone you love, was it ever loyalty at all? When the dust settled and the headlines faded, something strange began to happen. The story of Donnie Brasco had once been a classified FBI operation whispered only in backrooms and courtrooms started to mutate into something larger than life. It left the realm of fact and began drifting into the shadowy space of legend. America, it turned out, couldn't resist a good gangster story, especially one dripping with betrayal, brotherhood, and moral decay. Lefty Ruggiero, the street-hardened soldier who'd lived his life by a dying code, became the tragic heartbeat of that legend. But before Hollywood lights painted his name in gold and the pages of magazines turned his downfall into art, the story simmered in the collective imagination. Every generation romanticizes its criminals. America, perhaps more than any other place on earth, turned its outlaws into folk heroes. Jesse James, Al Capone, John Dillinger, and, now, Lefty Guns, Ruggiero, the man who loved too deeply and trusted too much. After Donnie Brasco, My Undercover Life in the Mafia hit bookstores. Readers devoured it like scripture. They weren't just fascinated by Pistone's courage. They were haunted by Lefty's fragility. He wasn't the typical mob boss dripping in arrogance and cash. He was the small-time soldier, the grinder, the guy who still polished his shoes before a sit-down and prayed his number would come up someday. People connected with that. They saw themselves in the man who wanted to matter, who clung to loyalty as if it were oxygen in a city built on betrayal in Brooklyn. Old-timers sat in bars and argued about the story. Some said Lefty got what he deserved. You play the game, you take the fall. Others shook their heads and muttered, nah, he was old school. They don't make M like that no more. It was strange, the way the underworld processed grief. They didn't cry. They in their world, dying loyal livin' when loyalty killed you was the only kind of nobility left. Hollywood smelled blood and money. Producers circled the story like sharks, knowing it had all the ingredients: undercover intrigue, moral conflict, tragic friendship. When Donnie Brasco, the film, was released in 1997, starring Al Pacino as Lefty and Johnny Depp as Donnie, it hit like a thunderclap. The movie wasn't just a hit, it was a mirror held up to America's obsession with its own dark reflection. Pacino's portrayal of Lefty was haunting, tender, broken. He wasn't a monster. He was a tired man in a worn-out suit, feeding pigeons on a rooftop while the world beneath him crumbled. And in that performance, something profound happened. Lefty Ruggiero, the real man, became a symbol. He became the last loyal soldier. Audiences didn't just watch him, they mourned him. The film turned betrayal into tragedy and loyalty into poetry. But for the real men who had lived that world, it wasn't poetry, it was pain. Some of the old wise guys who had known Lefty refused to see the film. That ain't entertainment, one said. That's our lives. Another, after watching it, walked out halfway through. They made him too soft, he grumbled. Lefty was a good man, but he wasn't no saint. And yet, deep down, they knew Pacino had captured something real. That quiet desperation, that tired dignities, those weren't inventions. They were the echoes of 1,000 forgotten soldiers who'd lived and died by rules that no longer mattered. The cultural impact of Donnie Brasco rippled far beyond Hollywood. In classrooms, criminology students dissected it as a case study in moral compromise. In film schools, directors analyzed its humanism, its restraint, its refusal to glamorize violence. And in living rooms across America, families sat together and whispered the same thing. It's sad, isn't it? He trusted him. Trust, that single word had more gravity than bullets, more tragedy than any shootout. It was the thread that bound the story of Lefty and Donnie, and the one that unraveled everything. The film forced audiences to question their own moral certainties. Who was the real traitor? The cop who lied to bring justice, or the criminal who told the truth in a world built on lies? But beneath the applause and the box office success, something darker stirred. The Mafia's allure began to change shape. Once feared, now it was fetishized. Young men watched the movie not as a cautionary tale, but as inspiration. They admired the suits, the slang, the swagger. They missed the point entirely. What had been meant as tragedy became, in the wrong hands, an instruction manual. Joe Pistone himself spoke about it in later years, frustration in his voice. People don't understand, he said. I wasn't playing dress-up. That was my life, every day, not knowing if I'd make it home. And Lefty, he wasn't a movie character. He was a man, a lonely, broken man. But that's the curse of every legend. The truth drowns in its own myth. For Lefty's surviving family, fame was a double-edged sword. His name was suddenly everywhere, on billboards, in magazines, on TV. Strangers debated his morality, his loyalty, his intelligence. They forgot he was a father, a husband, a human being who used to sit by a window and listen to Sinatra records, staring into the city that never gave him much back. His daughter once said, "I can't hate Joe. My father chose that life. But I wish people remembered the good parts of him, not just the wise guy stuff." Those good parts were buried under years of crime reports and Hollywood fiction, but they existed. He loved animals. He gave away money he didn't have. He taught neighborhood kids how to throw a baseball. He wasn't cruel, just lost in a system that rewarded cruelty. And when that system abandoned him, he didn't know how to live outside it. That, more than anything, is what made Lefty tragic. He couldn't exist in a world without the code. Even when the code stopped existing for him, the years after the movie's release turned Lefty into a paradox. He was both cautionary tale and cult hero, both villain and victim. Mob enthusiasts debated his choices on message boards. Film critics called him one of cinema's great tragic figures. Historians called him the last true believer. But for those who had really known him, he remained something simpler, man who died the same way he lived, believing in the wrong people for the right reasons. And perhaps that's why his story endures. Because underneath the blood and the betrayal, it's not really about the Mafia at all. It's about us. It's about what happens when loyalty becomes a curse, when friendship becomes a weapon, when love becomes indistinguishable from destruction. It's about the quiet sadness of realizing that the world you built your identity around never really existed by the time the world had finished consuming the legend of Donnie and Lefty. The real Mafia was a ghost of its former self. The 5 families were fractured, their codes corrupted, their influence diminished. The next generation of gangsters wore suits from department stores instead of tailors. They texted instead of whispered. They killed for money, not honor. The world Lefty had bled for was gone, and yet his story remained. Ghost story told in the language of regret. For Joe Pistone, every new retelling brought a strange mix of pride and sorrow. He had survived something extraordinary, but at a cost that couldn't be measured in medals or movie deals. And for Lefty Ruggiero, even in death, the world wouldn't let him rest. His name became shorthand for the old way, where loyalty mattered more than logic, where a handshake sealed a man's fate, and where friendship was the most dangerous gamble of all. In a world obsessed with heroes and villains, Lefty occupied the uncomfortable middle ground, the gray area where morality bends and humanity breaks. That's why the story lasts, because deep down, everyone sees a little of themselves in him. The man who just wanted to be somebody, the man who stayed loyal when he shouldn't have, the man who mistook friendship for fate. The legend of Lefty Ruggiero lived on, not in the streets he walked, not in the pigeons he fed, but in the imagination of a world that both condemned and admired him. Because some ghosts don't haunt places, they haunt ideas, and Lefty, even now, still whispers through every retelling. Loyalty ain't what you say, it's what you die for. Long after the cameras stopped rolling and the FBI files were sealed away, the story of Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero didn't end. It merely slipped into quieter corners, into the lives of those left to live with the wreckage. Because every gangster's fall, no matter how loud, leaves behind an echo. It's in the families who bear their names, in the friends who turn their faces away, in the city blocks that forget them one day at a time. Lefty's story was no exception. It just hit harder because of what he represented. When the old man disappeared, there were no headlines, no funerals, just whispers. In Little Italy and on the streets of Brooklyn, a rumor floated through the bars and barbershops. They finally got Lefty. For some, it was a relief, another loose end tied up. For others, it was the closing of a chapter. But for his family, it was a silence that screamed. No body, no goodbye, just the weight of a legacy they hadn't asked for. His wife had spent years living with the fear that one day the door would never open again. Every time the phone rang, her stomach dropped. Every time a car slowed down in front of the house, she held her breath. And when the day came that the door didn't open, when he simply vanished from her life, like smoke from a cigarette, there was no shock left to feel, just a hollow kind of acceptance. Because that's what it meant to love a man like Lefty, to know that he belonged more to the streets than to you. His children carried that weight too. Growing up as the son or daughter of a gangster isn't glamorous. It's like living under a shadow that never moves. The name Ruggiero carried a quiet kind of stigma, admiration from some, suspicion from others. Teachers whispered. Neighbors stared. Employers hesitated. People wanted to know, did your father really do all that? As if the truth were a souvenir. But for them, it wasn't a myth. It was the smell of late-night smoke, the silence at the dinner table, the sense that something dark always lingered outside the window. One of his relatives once said in an interview, "We didn't lose him when he died. We lost him long before that. Life took him from us, piece by piece." That's the real tragedy of the Mafia, not the bodies or the bullets, but the erosion of everything human around it. And yet, despite all the pain, there was pride too. Not pride in the crimes, but in the man who had once been a protector, a provider, a father who never missed a birthday, even when the world around him was falling apart. People forget that gangsters don't start out as villains. They start out as survivors. They just get lost along the way. For Joe Pistone, the man who had once called himself Donnie the Aftermath, wasn't easy either. The Bureau praised him, Hollywood celebrated him, but inside there was a guilt he could never quite scrub clean. He'd infiltrated a family, lived among them, eaten with them, laughed with them, and then destroyed them. It was his job, yes. It was necessary, yes. But every night when he tried to sleep, the image of Lefty's weary eyes followed him. Pistone once said in an interview years later, "I still think about him." You don't live that close to a man and not carry him with you. And you could hear it in his voice, not guilt for doing his duty, but sorrow for the price of it. Because no matter how you frame it, betrayal changes you. It leaves a mark on both sides. The Bureau moved on to other cases, other operations, but Donnie Brasco never really left the room. For every young agent who read the case file, it was both a manual and a warning. Don't get too close. Don't lose yourself in the role. But that's easier said than done. Pistone's 6 years undercover blurred the line between performance and identity so thoroughly that even he, at times, struggled to separate the two. When you spend that long pretending to be someone else, a piece of that person always stays inside you. Lefty's old friends didn't talk much after his death. They had their own ghosts. Some turned informants, others faded into obscurity. The mob wasn't what it used to be anyway. The rules had changed, the codes broken. The new generation didn't care about omerta or honor. They cared about money and power. And in that world, there was no room for someone like Lefty man to loyal for his own good. In the early 2000s, a few journalists tried to track down what remained of his world. They found shuttered social clubs, aging wise guys on oxygen tanks, neighborhoods that had traded Italian bakeries for vape shops. The old faces were gone, replaced by ghosts. The photographs that once hung proudly on the walls, men in suits, smiling at weddings and christenings, were now tucked away in boxes, forgotten relics of a vanished kingdom. But every now and then, in some forgotten corner of Mulberry Street or Bay Ridge, someone would still tell the story. Usually an old man, cigarette in hand, voice low and raspy. "You remember Lefty?" he'd say. "Yeah, he got a raw deal. He wasn't no rat. He went out the right way." And for a moment, in the haze of memory, the legend flickered back to life. Meanwhile, the cultural machine kept spinning. Documentaries, books, podcasts, everyone wanted a piece of the story. But the more it was retold, the more it drifted from the truth. Lefty became a metaphor, a symbol of a time when even criminals believed in something bigger than themselves. People forgot the blood, the fear, the loneliness. They remembered the loyalty. They remembered the heartbreak. But those who really knew, those who lived it, knew better. They knew that loyalty was never clean. It was messy. It was painful. It demanded everything. And it was rarely returned. As years turned into decades, Pistone aged quietly, carrying his memories like a secret weapon he never wanted to use again. He gave lectures, wrote books, trained agents, but every time he talked about Lefty, his tone softened. He spoke not of mob hits or wiretaps, but of humanity, of friendship, of the strange, fragile bond that grew between two men who should have been enemies. And perhaps that's why the story continues to resonate, because beneath the suits and slang, the codes and killings, it's a story about connection, about two men from opposite sides of the law finding something real in a world built on lies and losing it the only way they could dot in a city that never sleeps. Ghosts linger in every alleyway, every diner booth, every rain-soaked corner where deals were once made. They say time heals all wounds, but the truth is, some wounds just change shape. The FBI still tells the Donnie Brasco story in training manuals. The mob still whispers his name with bitterness. And somewhere in the collective conscience of New York, the spirit of Lefty Ruggiero still walks the streets, cigarette smoke curling into the night, muttering to himself, "Loyalty don't mean nothin' if you're the only one living by it." The legacy of that friendship, if you can call it, that became a lesson in irony. The undercover cop became a legend for his betrayal. The betrayed gangster became immortal for his loyalty. And together they wrote one of the most haunting chapters in the story of American crime. Because when you strip away the guns, the money, the codes, what remains are the ghosts, the people who believed, who trusted, who fell. And they don't haunt you with screams. They haunt you with silence. And that's the silence that still hangs over the story of Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero. A silence that no movie, no book, no retelling can ever quite fill. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the American Mafia was crumbling not in one dramatic explosion, but in a slow, grinding decay that ate it from the inside out. The men who once walked the streets like kings were either behind bars, wearing wires, or buried in unmarked graves. The old rules, the sacred code of omerta, the whispered laws of respect, loyalty, and silence were no longer gospel. They were history. And in that history, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero became something of a relic fossil from a time when loyalty meant everything, even if it killed you for decades. Omerta had been the spine of the Mafia. It was what separated them from every other street gang or criminal outfit. You didn't talk. You didn't betray. You took the fall with pride. You went to prison and kept your mouth shut because that was what being a man meant in their world. The Mafia didn't need laws. They had the code. And for men like Lefty, that code was holy. It wasn't written in books or recorded on tapes. It lived in the blood, passed down through stories told in smoky social clubs and whispered warnings after midnight. But by the time Lefty's world fell apart, the new generation had stopped believing. Crack cocaine flooded the neighborhoods, violence became cheap, and respect turned into currency. Younger gangsters didn't care about tradition, they cared about fast money and Instagram-like attention. Decades before social media even existed, the mob was evolving into something colder, something more transactional. The old way was too slow, too moral, too human. You could see it in the faces of the wise guys who survived the 70s. The light was gone. They'd spend their afternoons in half-empty bars, grumbling about the kids today, the ones who didn't know the difference between loyalty and leverage. They remembered when a man's word was everything, when even murder had rules. But those rules were dissolving. The code that had once made the Mafia powerful was now its weakness. And maybe that's why Lefty's story hit so hard. Because he was the last of them, the last believer in a system already rotting from within. Even as his world betrayed him, he clung to omerta like it was the only truth left. He'd tell anyone who would listen, "You don't rat, you don't run, you take what comes." But what came for Lefty wasn't glory, it was silence. After the Donnie Brasco operation, the FBI's RICO cases tore through the Mafia like wildfire. The days of the untouchable dons were over. Men who once commanded fear were suddenly taking plea deals, trading loyalty for leniency. The names that once carried power, Bonano, Lucchese, Colombo, became court transcripts. The newspapers printed their faces. The judges handed down sentences, and the world watched as an empire built on silence was undone by confession inside prison walls. The old-timers stared in disbelief as former friends testified against them. It was a betrayal deeper than death. "You do 20 years standing tall," one inmate said, "and then you see your best friend on the stand, wearing a suit, pointing right at you." That was the death of the code, not some Hollywood gunfight. It was the quiet sound of a man's voice saying it was him. Lefty never broke, even when he had every reason to. Even when the FBI came knocking, offering protection, offering a chance to start over, he wouldn't do it. "I ain't no rat," he said, and he meant it. But in the end, the code didn't protect him. It left him stranded. The men he'd bled for vanished. The bosses who had used his loyalty as a weapon disappeared into witness protection or federal prisons. The organization he'd defended his whole life turned its back on him when he needed it most. That's the cruel irony of the Mafia code. It was never really about honor. It was about control. The code kept the soldiers obedient, kept the machine running. But once that machine started falling apart, the code was exposed for what it was, a myth. A beautiful, deadly myth. By the time Lefty was gone, the Mafia was unrecognizable. The social clubs that once pulsed with life were empty. The streets that had echoed with laughter and deals were now silent, or worse, gentrified. The new breed of criminal didn't care about neighborhood loyalty or family connections. They cared about profits, efficiency, anonymity. Crime had gone corporate. The old world mobster, with his sharp suit and sharper code, was extinct. And yet, despite everything, people still romanticized that extinction. Movies like Goodfellas, Casino, and The Sopranos kept the myth alive. They painted the Mafia not as a system of fear, but as a brotherhood of flawed men, complex, tragic, human. People wanted to believe in the code because it gave meaning to chaos. Even as the real mob crumbled, the idea of the mob grew stronger than ever. Lefty, in many ways, became the symbol of that illusion. His life, full of loyalty, pain, and betrayal, was proof that the old ways had heart, even if they were doomed. The younger generation of wise guys might have mocked him, but they couldn't ignore him, because deep down, they knew they'd never be what he was, devoted to something bigger than themselves. Even if that something was corrupt, there's a kind of poetry in that dying for an idea that no longer exists. The same poetry that makes people still talk about Lefty decades later. Because while everyone else was learning how to survive, Lefty was still trying to live by a rule book written in another era. One of the last men who knew him said, "Lefty was a dinosaur. He couldn't evolve, but you gotta respect him. He went out his way." That, in the end, was the mark of a true old-school gangster. He didn't adapt. He didn't bend. He broke, and as the Mafia's golden age turned to rust, the irony became impossible to ignore. The very code that had made them strong was what destroyed them. Loyalty turned to weakness, honor turned to leverage, and silence turned to isolation. The FBI didn't just expose their crimes, they exposed their contradictions. Lefty's death, quiet and unremarkable, wasn't just the end of a man. It was the funeral for an entire philosophy. The Mafia had built its empire on trust, and when that trust died, everything else followed. Even Joe Pistone admitted it years later. Lefty, he said, wasn't meant for the world that came after him. He couldn't have lived in it, and he was right. The 1990s Mafia was sleek, paranoid, digital. There was no room for men who believed in handshakes and promises. But there was something tragic about watching that world fade. Because for all its violence and corruption, it was a world where words mattered, where loyalty had weight, where identity was more than a hustle. The modern mob lost that. It traded loyalty for survival, and in doing so, it lost its soul. When people today talk about the Mafia, they talk about power, about money, about blood. But those who lived through it remember something else, the slow, painful unraveling of a culture that once thought itself immortal. They remember men like Lefty, standing on the corner with a cigarette and a story. shaking their heads as the kids ran by with pagers and greed in their eyes. Lefty. Ruggiero didn't just belong to a dying world, he was that world. Every wrinkle on his face told a story of promises made and broken, of a life lived by rules that no longer applied. And when he finally disappeared, it wasn't just the end of his story. It was the final exhale of an entire era. The Mafia didn't die with a bang, it died with a whisper that said, "We don't make M like that anymore." By the mid-1990s, the world had changed, but Lefty Ruggiero's ghost had not. His life, once confined to smoky back rooms and whispered deals, had spilled into every screen, magazine, and conversation. The movie Donnie Brasco didn't just revive a story, it rewired how people saw gangsters. And that, perhaps, was the strangest twist of all. The underworld had collapsed, but its mythology had never been stronger. In dim living rooms across America, families pressed play and watched Al Pacino shuffle through rain-slicked streets as Lefty. They saw the wrinkles, the cheap suits, the tired eyes, and something inside them stir, a mixture of pity and awe. The man who'd once lived by a code of silence was suddenly a household name. But the version of him that flickered on the screen was not the same one that had lived and died in the narrow canyons of Brooklyn. Hollywood had polished his tragedy into poetry, stripped it of the grime, and left only the writers, critics, and dreamers devoured it. To them, Lefty wasn't just a gangster, he was a metaphor for loyalty in a world that had forgotten how to keep promises. Musicians referenced him in lyrics. Filmmakers borrowed his melancholy. The very system that had once feared the Mafia now couldn't stop romanticizing it. The myth of the noble criminal had come full circle. The strange irony was that the more people talked about loyalty, the less it existed. Culture was shifting into an age of spectacle, and betrayal had become entertainment. Reality television, tabloid confessions, leaked tapes truth was no longer sacred. And yet there was Lefty, frozen in film, a man who had died for the idea that words still meant something. The contrast was almost cruel. Film students dissected Donnie Brasco like a moral equation. Was Donnie the hero or the villain? Was Lefty a fool or a saint? No one could agree, and that's why the story endured. The ambiguity made it timeless. In a world that loved clear heroes, Lefty refused to fit. He was both an ordinary man, trapped between loyalty and survival, punished for being human in a profession that demanded monsters. Behind closed doors, the real Joe Pistone was watching too. He didn't hate the film, but it carried a quiet weight. The public loved the version of events that ended with moral clarity, but the truth was murkier. The real friendship, the unspoken tenderness of two men who trusted each other under false pretenses that couldn't be captured on camera. Pistone would later say, "People think I fooled him, but I fooled myself too." That sentence, simple as it was, carried years of guilt and reflection. Lefty's surviving relatives watched the world turn his life into legend with mixed emotions. On one hand, it was strange comfort that he was remembered at all. On the other, it hurt to see him reduced to a role, a performance. They made him famous, one family member said, but they didn't make him whole. Hollywood had stolen the man and sold the myth, but myths have a way of keeping people alive. In every rerun, every quote, every late-night discussion, Lefty breathed again. People who had never walked the streets of New York spoke about him as if they'd known him. College kids in far-off countries wore t-shirts with his name, not knowing the real man had died, nearly penniless and alone. That's how legends work. They belong to everyone but the truth. Fascination with Lefty and the code of the old Mafia bled into new art. The Sopranos picked up where Donnie Brasco left, off exploring the emptiness behind the suits, the therapy sessions behind the bravado. Tony Soprano, haunted by panic attacks, was a mirror of Lefty's weariness. The world had grown tired of invincible gangsters. It wanted men who crumbled under the weight of their own lies. In that way, Lefty became the blueprint for a new era of storytelling. Crime as tragedy, not triumph. Even the language of cinema changed. The slow jazz, the rain-soaked windows, the lonely diner scenes, all echoes of that one man feeding pigeons on a rooftop. It wasn't violence that audiences remembered. It was loneliness. They saw in Lefty what they feared in themselves, the desire to matter, the pain of being forgotten, the futility of devotion in a faithless world. Journalists began calling the phenomenon the romanticization of betrayal. The idea that we, as a culture, had fallen in love with tragedy, that we wanted to believe loyalty still existed, even if only in criminals. Politicians lied, corporations cheated, and the average person felt powerless. So they turned to the only figures who still seemed to live by a code, however broken, the gangsters of memory. And so Lefty, unwillingly, became a saint of loyalty in an age of hypocrisy. His story was replayed not because it was rare, but because it was recognizable. Everyone had been betrayed by someone. Everyone had trusted the wrong person. His life was extreme, yes, but emotionally, it was universal. When Donnie Brasco won awards, the industry congratulated itself on telling the truth. But the truth was too complicated to fit on stage. The real man had been poor, sick, and forgotten when he died. The code he lived by was gone, replaced by agents, scripts, and contracts. Yet maybe, in some twisted way, that was justice. Maybe the world needed to believe in Lefty more than Lefty ever needed the world. Years later, when Joe Pistone was asked if he regretted what happened, he paused. "I regret the way it ended," he said softly. He deserved better. There was no bravado in his voice, just, and that's the thing about betrayal, it doesn't age well. The deeper it goes, the heavier it becomes. By the early 2000s, Donnie Brasco was part of school curriculums, FBI training, and pop culture trivia. Students analyzed it. Detectives quoted it. It had become a moral parable disguised as entertainment. But in the neighborhoods where it had all begun, the echoes were quieter. The bars were closed, the clubs turned into condos, the pigeons were gone too. The city had moved on, but the legend had not. Every few years, someone new would rediscover the film, watch Pacino's final walk into the rain, and wonder, did that really happen? Did they really kill him? The uncertainty was part of the magic. Nobody knew for sure. And so Lefty lived on, half real, half myth, just like the code he died for. The story of Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero had transformed into something greater than history. It had become ritual. Each retelling was an act of mourning for a world where loyalty had meaning. Every viewer, whether they realized it or not, was participating in a kind of modern folklore, lighting a candle for the last man who believed. and somewhere, beneath the hum of the city, that belief still flickered. In the corners of old cafes, in the pages of forgotten biographies, in the way people still spoke his name with a mixture of sorrow and respect. Lefty Ruggiero had become what every gangster secretly wanted to be: unforgettable. Not because of power, not because of money, but because he was human enough to break and proud enough to never admit it. By the early 2000s, the legend of Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero was no longer confined to the faded alleys of Little Italy or the quiet corners of Brooklyn bars. His story had been commercialized, analyzed, dramatized, and sold 1,000 times over. The man who once lived and died by loyalty was now a brand, a symbol that could be packaged and monetized. The transformation was complete. The truth had become an industry. FBI agents, journalists, filmmakers, and crime historians all circled the legend like moths around a flame. The Bureau, once so careful about secrecy, now openly embraced its undercover triumph. Lectures were given in universities about Operation Donnie Brasco, about how deep infiltration could dismantle even the most secretive criminal networks. Agents who had never met Lefty quoted his name in seminars, using him as an example of old-world loyalty that could no longer survive in modern crime. The irony was hard to miss. The very institution that orchestrated his downfall was now immortalizing him as a moral lesson. The film industry followed suit. Donnie Brasco became a touchstone, referenced in every gangster movie that came after. Writers borrowed its tone, its melancholy, its moral ambiguity. The industry realized that audiences didn't want glorified violence anymore. They wanted tragedy. They wanted to feel something for the man pulling the trigger. Lefty's story gave them that. He wasn't a kingpin or a sociopath. He was a worker, an everyman in a brutal trade. He was loyal to a fault, to trusting, to human. And that's what sold soon. Documentaries, books, and podcasts followed. Each promised to uncover the real story, but in truth, they were all chasing the same ghost. Every retelling sanded away a little more of the reality, leaving behind a polished relic. The mythical gangster betrayed by friendship. Lefty's heartbreak had become a narrative archetype, reused by creators who had never walked his streets, never smelled the cigar smoke of the old bars, never heard the whisper of betrayal echo in their own chests. Even the FBI realized that the Donnie Brasco operation had become more than an investigation. It was a brand. Internal communications started referencing the case as a training benchmark. Recruits were shown clips from the film, taught about how empathy could be both a weapon and a weakness. The emotional core of the story, 2 men, 1 lie, 1 bond, had become a corporate parable. Meanwhile, on the streets, a new generation of hustlers had emerged. Kids who'd grown up watching The Sopranos, Goodfellas, and Donnie Brasco. To them, the Mafia was no longer a shadowy institution. It was pop culture. They mimicked the language, the gestures, the loyalty codes, not because they understood them, but because they looked powerful on camera. Social media was beginning to blur reality and performance, and the myth of men like Lefty fit perfectly into that distortion. Crime itself was changing. The new mobsters weren't sitting in smoky cafes or running neighborhood rackets. They were laundering money through digital fronts, moving power silently across international networks. The loyalty Lefty had died for didn't exist anymore. Betrayal was not a tragedy, it was a business strategy. And yet, when these new figures spoke about respect or honor, they often quoted lines from movies, not history. Fiction had replaced experience. Lefty's name came up in rap lyrics, in YouTube analyses, in online debates about realness. He became a shorthand for loyalty gone wrong, for faith misplaced. The world had turned his pain into content. Every retelling stripped the story of one more layer of complexity, turning a deeply human tragedy into a commodity. Even now, documentaries were pitched not with the question what happened, but what can we sell? Yet, amid the noise, there were still a few who sought to restore the truth. Retired agents who'd known him, journalists who'd studied court transcripts. They spoke of a man who loved deeply, who was capable of humor and tenderness, who cared for his pigeons like they were children. They described the heartbreak of realizing that loyalty had no place in the modern underworld. That's the part the films never captured. The quiet despair of a man who outlived his own code. There was a documentary filmmaker named Ray DeSalvo who once said, "Every time I talk about Lefty, someone asks if I think he was stupid, and I always say no. He was pure, and purity doesn't survive in dirty systems." That statement spread online like wildfire. It summarized everything people subconsciously felt about Lefty. He wasn't naive. He was genuine in a world built on manipulation. Meanwhile, Pistone, the man who had once been Donnie Brasco, continued to wrestle with his own legacy. He gave interviews, wrote books, advised law enforcement. But no matter how often he clarified the facts, the myth always overpowered the truth. People wanted the movie version, the friendship, the betrayal, the rain-soaked goodbye, Pistone's real emotions, the sleepless nights, the guilt that came with survival. Those didn't fit the story people wanted to believe, and that's what made Lefty's posthumous fame so haunting. The man who had lived in obscurity, who had died with little recognition, now existed everywhere, but not as himself. His ghost had been repainted too many times. His tragedy had been reshaped into spectacle. The same world that had chewed him up now wore his name like a badge of authenticity as the years passed. The brand of Donnie Brasco became an entire ecosystem. Actors gave interviews about what the film meant to them. Crime historians debated its accuracy. Late-night hosts made jokes about going full Lefty. It was as if the entire culture had decided that the best way to honor loyalty was to sell it. But beneath that commercialization, something deeper stirred. Audiences, especially younger ones, found themselves drawn not to the glamour of mob life, but to the melancholy of its decline. They saw in Lefty's story a reflection of their own world, a time when promises were fragile, trust was currency, and everyone feared being replaced. Lefty's loyalty wasn't just old-fashioned, it was extinct, and in that extinction, people found beauty. That's the paradox of his legacy. He was betrayed by his best friend, destroyed by the institution that recorded his death, and yet immortalized by the same system that devoured him. He had become both victim and symbol. His name no longer belonged to him. It belonged to anyone who had ever believed in something that didn't last. By the mid-2010s, Lefty's story had been absorbed into the bloodstream of culture. His image, sometimes a silhouette under a street lamp, sometimes a face lost in cigarette smoke, became an icon of loyalty and loss. Merch, posters, and quotes flooded the internet. It was no longer about Benjamin Ruggiero the man. It was about the idea of him, a relic from an age where even the worst men kept their word. The FBI may have taken down the Mafia, but they couldn't destroy its mythology. If anything, they had made it stronger, cleaner, safer, something people could admire without fear. The world had changed, but it still craved stories about faith, loyalty, and betrayal. And that's what Lefty's life had become, a mirror for everyone trying to survive in systems that no longer honored trust. The strange part was that if Lefty were alive to see it all, the books, the movies, the podcasts, the endless discussions, he probably would have laughed, maybe even smirked, that small, tired grin that came with decades of irony, because deep down he would have known what everyone else didn't, that the world will always sell loyalty, but never live it, and somewhere in the flicker of a screen, the last frame of Donnie Brasco still plays. Pacino's Lefty, walking into the rain, disappearing into the dark. The world remembers that image. They call it art, they call it cinema, they call it legend. But to those who know the truth, it's something simpler. A man who kept his word, even when the world didn't deserve it. The nights after Lefty's death were quieter, but not empty. In the corners of the old bars where he used to sit, the men who had once called him amico still whispered his name with a strange mixture of pity and fear. It was the kind of silence that follows a long echo, not quite gone, but fading, stretching itself across the years. To them, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero wasn't just another casualty of the Mafia's slow death. He was the last man who truly believed in its promise. The city around them had changed. The neon lights that once glowed over Mulberry Street now advertised souvenir shops and tourist cafes. The air no longer smelled like cigars and whiskey, but of roasted nuts and espresso served in paper cups. The world had moved on, but the ghost of loyalty lingered. It hovered in the cracked walls of those basements where old soldiers still played cards and argued about respect, a word that used to mean something before everything turned into business. Lefty's ghost wasn't vengeful. It didn't haunt with fear, but with memory. The people who had known him, a few old friends, a cousin, some of the young guys who used to fetch him coffee, found themselves recalling the small things, how he always tipped more than he had to, how he called everyone kid, how his voice softened when he spoke about the pigeons he kept on his rooftop. It wasn't the violence they remembered. It was the decency that somehow survived inside him, even when the world around him demanded cruelty. Joseph Pistone, the man who had once lived behind the mask of Donnie Brasco, carried his own kind of haunting. The Bureau gave him medals, recognition, the kind of glory that turns a man into a symbol. But there were nights when he sat alone in his living room, a muted television flickering in front of him, and he could still hear Lefty's voice in the back of his head. It wasn't accusation, it was familiarity, like a song you can't stop humming long after the record ends. He had spent years rationalizing what he'd done. He told himself it was duty, justice, necessity. He reminded himself that Lefty had chosen his life, that he knew the risks, but reason doesn't quiet the heart. Every undercover agent who's ever lived with a false name carries a shadow. Pistone's shadow had a name and a face, and it smoked, cursed, and called him Donnie. The FBI often presented Operation Donnie Brasco as one of its greatest triumphs, but behind closed doors, even the men who ran it admitted the human toll was unlike anything they had seen. The operation had blurred the line between truth and performance so thoroughly that for years, Pistone himself struggled to remember which moments were real and which were part of the act. The hardest part wasn't the violence or the secrecy, it was the intimacy. Lefty had invited him into his home, had let him hold his grandchildren, had trusted him with his life. Betraying a man like that wasn't a tactical move. It was a wound that didn't close. In interviews, Pistone often said he didn't regret the mission, but when he spoke about Lefty, his tone always shifted. It softened, slowed. There was something unspoken in his pauses, as though he still couldn't believe that loyalty like that could exist inside a man who'd done so much wrong. He knew Lefty was no saint, but he also knew that saints don't always look holy as the years rolled on. The idea of loyalty itself began to feel old-fashioned. The mob that had once sworn oaths of silence now leaked stories to journalists, sold memoirs, turned informants for profit. The streets were filled with ghosts of men who had once ruled them, but the code they died for had become a relic. Respect was now a brand. Loyalty was a slogan. Betrayal was a career move, and yet, every time a young man stumbled across the story of Lefty Ruggiero, something strange happened. Amid the blood and betrayal, they saw a kind of purity, not moral purity, but emotional. The purity of a man who loved the only way he knew how, completely. That kind of devotion, even to a broken system, carried a tragic beauty. There's a scene that crime historians often imagine, though it never happened. They picture Lefty sitting alone on his final night, the air thick with rain, the city humming faintly outside. Maybe he poured himself a small glass of whiskey. Maybe he thought of his pigeons. Or maybe he thought of Donnie, not with anger, but with a kind of weary understanding. Because, deep down, Lefty always knew the world wasn't fair. He knew the life he chose didn't owe him anything. And still, he stayed loyal. That's the haunting truth of his story. Lefty didn't die because he was betrayed. He died because he couldn't betray. It wasn't in him, even after the truth came out. Even after he learned Donnie was an FBI agent, he didn't curse his name. He didn't hunt for revenge. He simply said he did what he had to do. That single sentence carried the weight of an entire life. There's something profoundly human in that. To be betrayed and still forgive. To be abandoned and still remain true to your nature. It's what separates tragedy from mere misfortune. Tragedy is when the best part of a person destroys them. And that's exactly what happened to Lefty. Over time, those who studied his life began to see him as more than a gangster. He was a reflection of what happens when loyalty meets reality, when the heart refuses to adapt to a changing world. The Mafia had evolved into an institution of economics, not ethics. Men like Lefty, who lived by a moral code even in immorality, had no place left in it. Sociologists, writers, and even philosophers cited him as a symbol of misplaced faith, of what it means to believe in a system that no longer believes in you. Too many, Lefty became the last romantic in a cynical age. Joseph Pistone once admitted in a rare interview that he sometimes dreamt of Lefty, not the old, tired man of the later years, but the younger one, sharp, funny, alive. He said he often woke up with the smell of cigarette smoke in his nose, even though he hadn't smoked in years. He said he sometimes thought about picking up the phone, calling the old number, hearing that voice say, "Yeah, kid, what's up?" But there was no one left to answer. That's the cruel part of betrayal. It doesn't end with the act itself. It lingers. It echoes in the spaces where laughter used to be, in the silences that follow old songs. It turns memory into both comfort and punishment. Pistone lived with that contradiction, pride in his success, grief for his loss. And perhaps that's why Lefty's ghost endures, because he represents something we've all lost in one way or another. The ability to trust completely, to believe without hesitation, to love without calculation. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world slows down and the noise fades, that's the part of him that still speaks, not through words, but through feeling. You can almost hear him if you listen closely enough. The shuffle of footsteps on wet pavement, the low murmur of a jukebox in a forgotten bar, the soft clink of a glass being set down, and then that voice, half a sigh, half a smile, saying, "Hey kid, it's just business. Don't take it personal." But of course, it was always personal. Long after the gunshots stopped echoing in Brooklyn's alleys, after the coffee shops turned into tourist attractions and the old men who knew the real stories were gone, the world started to tell its own version of the tale. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero had become a movie, a symbol, a tragic muse for storytellers who never smelled the dust of mulberry street or heard the soft creak of the bar stool where he used to sit. The truth was fading, but the legend was growing. It began quietly, a film here, a documentary there, each one claiming to tell the truth, but dressing it up in the glamour of cinema. Donnie Brasco, when it was released in the late 1990s, became the definitive myth of betrayal and brotherhood. It wasn't just another mob movie, it was a tragedy. Shakespeare in a trench coat, Al Pacino's weary eyes, and Johnny Depp's guilt-ridden silence gave a face to two real men who'd lived a story no script could truly capture. The movie turned loyalty into poetry, betrayal into art, and yet, for all its truth, it also created something that never really existed, a romanticized version of pain. Audiences wept for Lefty, rooted for Donnie, and whispered about how sad it must have been for two men on opposite sides of justice to love each other like family. The irony, most of those same people would have crossed the street if they saw the real Lefty, a tired, aging mobster with nicotine-stained fingers and a wallet that was always empty. But on screen, he became eternal. Cinema gave him what life never did by the late 1980s. The streets that once trembled at the whisper of mob names had gone quiet. The neon lights in Little Italy flickered like dying candles, and the old cafes where men like Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero once held court were now filled with tourists chasing nostalgia they could never understand. The FBI had won, the Mafia had turned on itself, and the age of the gentleman gangster had withered into rumor. And somewhere, in the small corners of Brooklyn, where the past refused to die completely, Lefty was still alive, breathing, walking, existing. But he was no longer the same man. After Donnie Brasco vanished and the truth came out, everything stopped for Lefty. The calls ceased, the visits disappeared, and the so-called friends he once protected either turned rat or turned ghost. He knew what the rules said. A man in his position was supposed to vanish. One morning, when the FBI intercepted him on his way out of his apartment, they quietly told him what everyone else was too afraid to. "You're next, Lefty. They're coming for you." It wasn't sympathy. It was a fact. The Bureau had already taped the hit order. They offered him protection, but to Lefty, that was worse than death. The old code didn't allow surrender. Not to cops. Not to anyone. He was 65 years old, broke, arthritic, and tired. But when he looked in the mirror, he still saw the same soldier. He told the agents, "I lived like a wise guy, and I'll die like one." That line wasn't bravado. It was acceptance, a quiet oath spoken by a man who no longer cared whether anyone remembered him. But fate, as always, had its own irony. The mob never got to him, whether out of confusion, distraction, or a twisted sense of mercy. The contract faded away like smoke. Maybe the higher-ups figured he wasn't worth the trouble. Maybe they believed he'd suffered enough. In the end, Lefty wasn't shot. He wasn't dumped in a river. He just disappeared from the world he'd died to protect. He moved in with family, kept his head down, and lived the kind of life he used to mock. Ordinary, invisible, quiet. Gone were the tailored suits, the gold chains, the alligator shoes. His days became simple routines: a cup of coffee at dawn, an old newspaper by the window, a walk through streets that no longer recognized him. He didn't complain. He never begged for sympathy, but the silence was louder than any bullet he'd ever dodged. Sometimes, when the old-timers talked about him, they spoke in half-whispers, like invoking his name would jinx them. Lefty was one of the last real ones, they'd say. That wasn't flattery. It was respect, the kind that came from knowing the man had stood tall even when his entire world had collapsed. He never flipped. He never wrote a book. He never cashed in. While others sold their stories, Lefty kept his mouth shut. Even when his name became famous through Donnie Brasco, he stayed out of the spotlight. The movie made millions, but Lefty got nothing. He didn't want it. To him, the world owed him nothing, and he owed it nothing back. By the early 1990s, Lefty was living on the edge of obscurity. His health began to fail, but he didn't complain. He'd lived through gunfights, FBI raids, and betrayals. A bad heart wasn't going to scare him. He was still sharp enough to remember the days when his word meant something, when a handshake could seal a man's fate. Sometimes, sitting on the stoop outside his apartment, he'd talk to himself, reliving conversations with Donnie, the kid he'd once taken under his wing. "You played me good, kid," he'd mutter with a smirk. But even in his bitterness, there was affection. Deep down, he knew Donnie hadn't done it out of hate. He'd done it for his job. Lefty understood loyalty, even when it came from the other side of the badge, the cruelest part of aging. Though wasn't death, it was watching the world forget you. The Mafia had become a shadow of itself. The new generation didn't care about codes or family. They were reckless, greedy, digital. Loyalty was now a slogan, not a code. If Lefty saw them, he probably would have laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. The men who used to wear suits and speak softly had been replaced by loud, careless boys flashing guns on television. And for the first time, maybe he was glad he wasn't young anymore. Those who knew him in his final years said he carried himself with a strange kind of peace. He didn't rant about the past. He didn't regret the life he'd chosen. he'd simply accepted it. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was wisdom. Either way, the fire that once made him dangerous had turned into quiet embers, warm but fading. The tragedy wasn't that Lefty died alone. It was that he lived long enough to see everything he'd loved dissolve into myth. He passed away in 1994, officially of cancer, but those who understood him knew he'd been dying for years before that. The disease just finished what the betrayal started. No funeral with silk suits, no priest with Mafia condolences, just a quiet service, a few family members, and the sound of old Sinatra playing faintly in the background. A man's entire empire reduced to a melody. But maybe that's how he would have wanted it, because the truth is, Lefty Ruggiero never needed statues or headlines. His story wasn't meant to inspire, it was meant to warn. He was proof that the code doesn't protect anyone, it consumes them. And yet, even knowing that, he still followed it to the grave. That's not stupidity, that's conviction in its purest, most destructive form. He didn't want pity. He didn't believe in redemption. He just wanted to be remembered as what he truly was, a man who didn't bend. And so, in the end, the ghost of Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero isn't tragic because of how he died. It's tragic because he never learned how to live any other way. In his final days, he was neither hero nor villain. He was something rarer, a relic of a time when loyalty was worth dying for, even if it was built on lies. He walked out of this world the same way he walked through it, with his chin up, coat buttoned, and silence as his only defense. And maybe that's the final truth. The world moved on, but Lefty stayed frozen in that last quiet moment. A man who'd lost everything, but still held on to the only thing he had left, his word. When Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero died in 1994, it wasn't front-page news. The city that once trembled at the mention of his name had long since traded its gangsters for stockbrokers, its street codes for contracts. But something strange happened in the years that followed. The man who'd died quietly, poor, forgotten, and betrayed began to take on a new kind of immortality. Through movies, books, and whispers passed between fans of the underworld, Lefty Ruggiero was reborn, not as a killer, not even as a mobster, but as a symbol, a broken monument to loyalty in an era that no longer believed in it. It started with Donnie Brasco. The 1997 film hit theaters like a confession letter from a world that had been buried. Al Pacino's portrayal of Lefty wasn't caricature or comedy, it was heartbreak. You could see the years of wear in his eyes, the unspoken code that guided every gesture. Pacino didn't play him as a villain. He played him as a man who'd loved too deeply and trusted too wrongly. For millions of viewers, this was their first introduction to Lefty, not through the reality of his mugshots or FBI transcripts, but through celluloid empathy. Suddenly, the world was crying for a man who'd once made people disappear. But the truth, as always, was far messier than the movies. The real Lefty wasn't as poetic as Hollywood made him. He didn't speak in neat monologues. He was crude, funny, moody, and deeply human. Yet, when the film came out, he became something larger. The everyman gangster. A relic who stood for everything the Mafia had promised, but never delivered. Honor, brotherhood, sacrifice. People watched Donnie Brasco and said, Lefty got played. But the ones who understood said something else. Lefty played himself. Still, There was power in that, because Lefty's story wasn't just about betrayal, it was about faith. He had believed in a system that betrayed him, and in doing so, he became timeless. In an age where everyone switches sides for comfort, a man who dies sticking to his code, even a broken one, becomes myth. Soon, documentaries followed. FBI agents recounted the operation. Joseph Pistone, the real Donnie Brasco, gave interviews about his time undercover, always mentioning Lefty with respect and guilt. He said it plainly. If Lefty had known, he would have killed me, but he didn't deserve what he got. That was Pistone's truth. A man who spent years lying to Lefty, but still couldn't bring himself to hate him, because Lefty wasn't a monster. He was a reflection, the kind of man who'd lived by rules in a world that stopped following them, and that's where the myth began to twist. The more people learned about Lefty, the less they cared about his crimes. They romanticized him. They painted him as the tragic mentor, the street philosopher, the last of the real ones. His name started showing up in internet forums, Reddit threads, YouTube documentaries, each version more stylized than the last. Some called him the last loyal soldier. Others called him the fool who believed in ghosts. But no matter how they framed it, they couldn't ignore him. Lefty had become an archetype, the doomed believer. Even younger generations, who never lived through the Mafia's golden age, connected with him. They saw their own disillusionment in his eyes. A man promised meaning, only to find out it was all smoke. That's the irony of myth-making. The truth gets buried under the weight of the emotion it leaves behind. People didn't want Lefty's facts. They wanted his feeling. The sense that someone once cared about something enough to die for it. But those who had really known Lefty, the few who were still around, weren't comfortable with this glorification. One of his old friends once said in an interview, "People make him sound like a saint." He wasn't. He was a gangster, and he hurt people. But he also had heart. He just didn't know how to use it right. That's probably the truest thing ever said about him. The cultural afterlife of Benjamin Ruggiero became a strange paradox. He was remembered as both villain and victim, a teacher and a fool. But that duality, that tension, is exactly what keeps people talking. Because deep down, Lefty represents something raw and uncomfortable. The idea that loyalty, unchecked, can destroy the person who believes in it most. There's a scene in Donnie Brasco, the one that broke hearts, where Pacino's Lefty straightens his tie before walking out. Knowing he's about to die, he leaves his jewelry on the dresser, says goodbye to his wife, and walks into the night. That scene never actually happened, but it feels true. That's the power of myth. It replaces memory with meaning. It makes you feel something real, even when it's made up. And that's how Lefty, the forgotten soldier, became eternal, through the lie that told the truth. In the years after his death, the idea of Lefty became a currency of storytelling. Writers and filmmakers chased that same emotional rhythm, the broken mentor, the loyal man undone by betrayal. You can see echoes of him in characters across pop culture. From Tony Soprano's haunted father figures to Michael Mann's weary criminals, Lefty's DNA lives in them all. Because he represents something audiences crave but rarely find: sincerity. A man who doesn't pivot, who doesn't adapt, who refuses to betray himself even when everything collapses. And that's what separates Lefty from the rest. while other mobsters sold their stories, wrote books, became talk show material. Lefty stayed quiet. His silence became his statement. It said more about the Mafia than any documentary ever could. That's why his story still resonates. Not because he was powerful, but because he was powerless, and still held onto his code. By the time the 2000s rolled around, the Mafia had turned into a punchline. Reality shows, podcasts, and memes replaced the real thing. But amid all that noise, a small, loyal corner of fans kept the flame alive. They saw in Lefty what the modern world lacks: commitment. They didn't admire his crimes. They admired his consistency. The same man who refused to flip for the FBI is the same man who refused to flip on himself. And that, in a world of constant compromise, feels almost sacred. But myths are dangerous, because when you turn a man into a symbol, you erase the parts that make him human. You forget the nights he sat alone, broke and bitter. You forget the guilt, the mistakes, the violence. You forget that behind the myth was just a man, tired, flawed, and scared. The story of Lefty Ruggiero, stripped of all its glamour, is still just that. A story of a man who believed too much, loved too wrong, and lived too long. And yet, maybe that's what makes it beautiful. Because not all legends are built from victory. Some are carved from failure, from the echoes of what could have been. And in that failure lies something painfully honest, a reflection of us all. The city never remembered the exact night Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero died. But maybe that's fitting. The city had moved on. It was no longer the place of whispers and backroom deals. The bars that once echoed with laughter and betrayal now sold overpriced cocktails to tourists. The world Lefty had given everything to didn't even leave flowers at his grave. And yet, somehow, his story refused to die. It kept breathing in dark corners of the internet, in the soft hum of late-night documentaries, and in the imaginations of people who can't sleep. The ones who find strange comfort in stories like his. Because Long Gangster Nights aren't really about crime. They're about people, flawed, desperate, loyal, broken. Men like Lefty, who believed in something so deeply, it became their undoing. And in a world built on convenience, there's something almost sacred about that kind of conviction. You can hate him. You can pity him, but you can't forget him in the end. What remained of Benjamin Ruggiero wasn't a name on a wall or a memory in a movie. It was a question. What's the price of loyalty? Everyone wants to be loyal until loyalty starts costing them comfort, safety, or dreams. Lefty paid that price in full, with interest. Every friendship, every family moment, every ounce of peace he could have had, all gone in the name of a code that died before he did. But that's the haunting part. He never changed. Even when the FBI told him he'd been betrayed, even when his friends turned to ghosts, Lefty stayed who he was. A soldier, a believer, a man out of time. That kind of purity doesn't fit in the modern world. And maybe that's why his story still lingers, because deep down, we all know we've become too quick to bend. If you listen closely to the rain against your window right now, if you let your mind wander through the old streets of Little Italy, you can almost hear him, the scrape of a chair on the floor, the low murmur of a man talking to a kid he thought was family. The flick of a lighter, the slow inhale before a sentence that never finishes. His ghost isn't tragic, it's timeless. Because Lefty's not just a man you remember. He's a reminder of something you've lost. When Donnie Brasco hit the world, Hollywood painted him as the old man left behind, sad, used, broken. But the truth was more complicated. Lefty wasn't a victim. He wasn't stupid. He knew the game better than anyone. He just refused to stop playing it, even when it turned against him. That's not foolishness. That's faith. And faith, no matter how misplaced, has power. It's been decades now. But people still ask what happened to men like Lefty, to the real gangsters, the ones who believed in something beyond themselves. The answer's simple. They don't exist anymore. The world that created them disappeared, and in its place came something faster, colder, emptier. But stories like Lefty's, they're still needed, because they make us pause. They make us wonder if all our progress was really worth the cost. So tonight, as you listen to this, wherever you are, whatever time it is, think about what kind of person you want to be when no one's watching. Think about the lines you draw and the ones you cross. Think about the people you'd stand for, even when the world turns its back. That's the real lesson buried beneath the concrete of Lefty's life. Not about crime, not about the Mafia, about humanity, about what it means to keep your word, even when it breaks you. Because in the end, maybe that's all any of us have, our word. Lefty died believing that, and maybe that's why he still matters. He doesn't need a movie or a monument. His story lives in every person who's ever loved the wrong people, trusted the wrong hands, and still chosen not to become bitter. His legacy isn't written in money or power. It's written in the silence of people who remember him when the world goes quiet. And so, as this story fades into the hum of your room, remember this. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was a man. A complicated, loyal, broken man who refused to bend. And sometimes that's more powerful than anything else. If you've been here since the beginning of this long night, if you've walked through the alleys, felt betrayal, and listened to the echo of a man's life unraveling, then you know why we tell these stories. To feel something real again. So, if this one hit you, if you felt it somewhere deep inside, don't let it vanish. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to remember what loyalty used to mean. And if you're watching this under dim light, maybe half asleep, with the night whispering outside your window, you're part of the story now. This has been Long Gangster Nights, where the past never dies, it just smokes in silence. Good night, wherever you are.